I'm Dr. Rahel Briggs, the National Director of 0 to 3's Healthy Steps program. Healthy Steps is a cutting-edge program that embeds an early childhood development expert into the pediatric primary care setting to promote the health, well-being, and school readiness of infants and toddlers. I'm a child psychologist by training. I've always used that two-generation approach, and so I'm really glad that you're joining us today for an important conversation on maternal and child health. We know there is no child well-being without caregiver well-being. I'm pleased to be joined by two of 0 to 3's infant and early childhood mental health fellows. The first, Marquita Mays, is a clinical social worker and clinical supervisor in the Child Trauma Research Program at the University of California, San Francisco Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Services. She is also the co-director of Embrace, perinatal care for Black families. We are also joined by Carrie Schnacke, who is the director of the South Carolina Program for Infant and Toddler Care at the University of South Carolina and chief executive officer of the South Carolina Infant Mental Health Association. First, for you, Marquita, as a clinician on the ground right now in California, what have you seen over the course of the pandemic? How are families doing?
That's an interesting question because as to everything, there's two answers to that. I think for those families who have access to resources, for those families who have access to service providers that have been able to transition their care through telehealth and virtual platforms, those families are doing well and are still thriving. We have families that have found the silver lining during the pandemic and have actually been able to use this time to be at home with their kids, find ways to work with their children through their school platforms, through other ways of trying to keep them creative and keep them engaged. I've been really surprised at a lot of my moms where they're like, I actually needed this break. I didn't know I needed this break, and it's been very useful for me. And then on the other hand, there are other families who were suffering before the pandemic in ways where housing was not secure, food was not secure, healthcare was not secure. And we see that those families that didn't have things prior to the pandemic, that has just exacerbated the levels of stress and the levels of struggles that they're enduring right now. And for those families, we have really had to, figure out how to show up differently, how to show up more concretely, because we are in a pandemic, things were in a state of crisis, and we had to revert back to we're not just the clinician in the room, but we're someone who, with the resources that we have, how do we get you what you concretely need to get through day to day? So it's, depends on where the family are in their struggles, where the family are in sort of the silver lining of what the pandemic has been able to offer to them.
And almost where they started the pandemic. Is that fair? It's almost been a tale of two pandemics where, depending on how you were doing before COVID hit, it has a lot to do with how you're doing at this point.
Exactly. I think that hits the nail right on the head. Hits the nail right on the head.
Yeah, we have heard in our healthy steps practices around the country, as you just described, there's no good talking about toxic stress and serve and return if I can't get diapers. And if me getting diapers right now is the absolute primary thing I'm focused on, I'll get to all the rest of it. But first of all, can you help me with that? Right? Mm-hmm. And that caregiver stress or well-being and the ways in which that really has so much to do with how the child's doing.
Absolutely. We've had to gear up our clinicians, turn on that case manager hat. You turn on those case manager skills, and you use your clinical skills and you intertwine those things into how you serve families. But don't be afraid of getting into the weeds with families about what do you need and how can we actually concretely get that to you right now.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for that. Thank you, Marquita. Carrie, as we think about moving forward at this point, What do you think this means for children and their families and their caregivers in the months and years to come? What do you expect we might see?
Yeah, there's certainly an urgency, I think, to correct so many of the fractures in our systems that are impacting the health and well-being of families. Because, as we know, what a child experiences in their prenatal development through early childhood has lasting impacts and significant impacts on their future. So those earliest experiences are influencing how they perceive the world for the rest of their lives. It influences whether they become adults who are ready for relationships and cooperation and caring, or if they become adults who operate in the world with brains that were wired from childhood to perceive the world as dangerous, uncaring, and dependable, and then that informs who they become as adults and how they engage in the world. With it can be deeply rooted fear and mistrust that interrupts their ability to have healthy relationships. It can lead to a propensity for fear and hate towards others because hate feels like a way to safely buffer against the possibility of being rejected or judged, things that are going to resonate from early experiences. And we do not want to live in a world filled with adults who let hate and fear drive decisions. So, yes, there's potential for long-term consequences in really significant ways for individual children and families who are suffering right now, and for our society at large in the future. There's going to be long-term effects that we'll see down the road for babies who are experiencing toxic stress now because their caregivers are suffering from the amplified economic and emotional hardships that this pandemic has illuminated, particularly for children and families of color. But I hate to make it all gloom and doom, because I think there's also a tremendous amount of strength and perseverance and resilience in families that has shined through the hardships of the pandemic. I think about a case I heard recently of a grandmother who took in her toddler grandson in October, as the mother was having her own mental health issues. This is the fourth grandchild she's taken care of, and she's reached out for help because this toddler is having what she calls really extreme tantrums. He's to the point where he's getting bloody noses, he bangs his head on the wall, and it's particularly heightened after he has a visit with his mother. And so she doesn't know what to do, and she's at her wit's end, and wants to provide care for this child. And that's the story of love and strength, and having those children together with a family member who loves them is buffering the effects of the stress they've experienced. And I think that grandmother reaching out and asking for help, it's a vulnerable place to be in, but it's a strength to be able to say, I'm a grandmother, I have raised my own children, and now I'm raising another generation, and I still don't know what it is I should be doing for this child who is showing his need for love in the most unlovable way. And I think that's powerful, and it's a hopeful light that families all over the country are exhibiting in the muck of this pandemic. But we have to have the supports and services available for families that are reaching out to say, I need some help now.
Right. Yeah, you said so many important things in there. I think about the ability of families, whether they're biological parents, grandparents, all of the people that make up our families, and the ability of those adults to actually serve as a buffer, like you so eloquently described, is dependent on their well-being. It's dependent on their mental health. It's dependent on their stress, right? So as we look at their ability to really buffer those really negative effects of toxic stress so that their children don't experience them, we've got to focus on the lives that those adults are living and how well they can do that. Something you said also made me think about, as you spoke about these early years and how critically important they are. It's the foundation of a house, right? If you build that foundation successfully, the house can go through a storm, can go through a tornado, and it doesn't fall apart. But if that foundation isn't strong, then any little storm is really a threat. And as Jack Shonkoff so wisely, a former 0 to 3 board member, has so wisely taught us, Age 3 is middle age when it comes to brain development. We've got to get it right for these kids. They've had a year of a pandemic, which, as Marquita really said, has been a tale of two pandemics. And how can we make sure that from this point forward, we're doing everything we can so that that foundation is healthy and so that those caregivers can serve as the buffers that they hope to be?
Precisely. And I think we need to, caregivers beyond just families, the families and the helpers who support children and families are also suffering stress, and that is impacting their readiness to provide the stress buffer that the families need and look to support providers for help. And so there's this rippling effect, and it's attending to the wellness of all the adults in the children's lives, their primary caregivers and the folks who are supporting their primary caregivers.
Absolutely. And we're all tired, aren't we? Marquita, was there something that resonated there for you?
Yeah, as before you even spoke, Carrie, that was exactly what was coming to my mind. Is what has it been like supporting, the supervisees, the clinicians, the team around us, so that we can be ready to be available for families. And I've constantly reminded everyone in our team that we too are living through the pandemic. That the pandemic is happening to us as well as providers. And the more that we can find ways to take care of ourselves, we can translate that down to families. But to speak from families from like a place that's not real because we aren't taking care of ourselves is really inauthentic, and they feel that at times. And so, when I have encouraged supervisees to, tell a family, if you can't make your appointment today because you've reached your limit, it's okay. You can reschedule. You can find another time. That also lets the family know that when life is happening, because life is happening at a rapid pace right now, that they too can reschedule, and it is okay that if you don't make your hour, you don't make your hour. I just want to like really hit home that it is a rippling effect, and it's our babies, it's our families, and it's us as service providers that are all living through this pandemic.
Absolutely. And our ability to hold each other and hold space for each other and the realities we're experiencing so that we can then hold space for parents and caregivers who can then hold space for babies and children, right? It is that ripple effect that you described. I also was thinking as you were talking, Marquita, about I think, again, this tale of two pandemics, there's this idea that once folks get vaccinated, and once that part of the pandemic is solved for, or at least much better, that somehow solves a lot of problems. And for people who are suffering the economic side of this pandemic, who have lost jobs and lost housing, a vaccination doesn't change that.
It does not. We're going to need some transition time to still allow for those families that were behind before COVID to figure out still how to catch up a little bit. And, it would be great economically if there was a strategic plan. And I hope, our current president in office is figuring out how to buffer in that time for folks to be able to catch up and get back on board. But I think absolutely, and I even think about for our kiddos and for our babies who have been out of school and are integrating back into schools. There was a case recently where a little guy got expelled from his daycare, and it's after returning from almost a year of not being in that setting, and then kind of being plopped back into a daycare setting. And we had to really think and consult with that team on this is a huge transition for this little guy. He was at home. Home probably had its own stressors. And then we just threw him into another environment and said, you need to be ready. You need to adapt quickly to this. So I also think about sort of the buffers that our children need in order to transition back into whatever the new normal that will be, because it doesn't just happen at the snap of a finger or at the flick of a switch.
No, it certainly doesn't. And for us, I'm not guessing anybody's age, but for me, it's been 1/45th of my life. I'll just tell you. But for these kids, it's been half of their life or three quarters of their life already. So it's what they know. Thank you for talking about the policy side of this, Marquita, and sort of the ways in which we might actually build this back better, and the ways in which we might create some policies and practices that will really help babies and families get the support they need. So I wanted to pose that question to both of you. If you can, what policies would most help really make sure that the babies and families that we're all most worried about and most committed to working with get the help and the support that they need? Either one of you.
I can start. There's so many, but I will focus in because I think it permeates all of the kind of policies that we need, and that is a push for more attention to infant and early childhood mental health, not just to make sure that there are mental health providers who have the specialized training needed to attend to that early relationship that makes up infant mental health, but we really want that supports and attention to relational health in these early years to not just be relegated to mental health providers, but that every service provider and all of our policies and practices are taking into account the importance of infant mental health, that pregnant women, very young children, and their caregivers, we need to be promoting opportunities to support that relational health. This is childcare providers and early interventionists, obstetricians, pediatricians, child welfare workers, family court judges. We have to do a better job at recognizing how just absolutely essential it is for the good of our society to prioritize relationship-focused supports for young children and families. And it's disappointing, I think, that it takes a special program to make sure that families get the holistic support needed to grow a healthy and happy baby. We all know that the African proverb, "It takes a village." It's used a lot. People agree with that sentiment, but our policies certainly don't reflect that stance. I think about, I'm involved right now in establishing some safe baby court at a few sites. It is an amazing program, and the outcomes are remarkable. But I am regularly struck by how the approach it's not really anything special. It's just humanizing families rather than judging and shaming. It's wrapping them in supports to make sure they can overcome the barriers that have been placed in their path to be successful. Healthy Steps is a similar. It's an amazing, lovely program with incredible outcomes, and it should be every parent's experience. Not just a special service that's available to families who happen to find a pediatric office that managed to get some funding to bring this model to their practice. Healthy Steps should be everywhere, every family's experience. So we've got to do better, I think, all around in prioritizing children and families. It's it's short-sighted to do otherwise, and out of the devastation of this pandemic, we have the opportunity to do better, and so I sure hope we will.
I almost hear you saying we need to operationalize that village, right?
That's right.
Not just let everybody say that proverb and move on, but really start to talk about what that means. And that means, as you said, family court, early care and education, pediatrics, faith-based organizations, all sorts of components that make up that village. And I think the other thing I heard you say was funding, right? Until we fund prevention-focused infant and early childhood mental health, right? Not waiting until children have a diagnosis, because any 1-year-old or 2-year-old whose concerns are big enough that they qualify for a diagnosis, that's too late. The village failed, right? The village needed to get involved much earlier than that. And in order to do so effectively, we need to pay for prevention and create policies that pay for prevention in this early childhood behavioral health space. Just like we get to go to the dentist twice a year, that's preventive and that's paid for. What about some regular checkups on our young children's behavioral health and their family health, right? It's really bringing some operationalization to that village and bringing some payment teeth to how that gets done. Marquita, what are your thoughts in this space about policies and other practices that can really pave the way for us to do better moving forward in this space.
Yeah. So, I do early infant childhood work, and I also do perinatal work. And within the pandemic, what I've seen during the perinatal phase is that things have shifted pretty quickly. We've had to figure out how to transfer our services over into the virtual world, even with supporting moms as they are growing and developing a life inside of them. And with the program that we have put in place for moms, we've realized a few things. We need to recognize the fourth trimester of pregnancy. We need to recognize that postpartum period. It is more than just 6 to 8 weeks. It is more than just 3 months. But we really need to acknowledge that postpartum is a full year after giving birth and normalize the kind of care that mothers and families need during pregnancy so that we can start at that point with normalizing what getting support is, what getting help is, and then creating the buffers that they need as they transition into becoming parents, integrating another child into their family system a year after giving birth, because it takes that long to just find like some kind of legs up underneath you. So I think, whatever policies that we can put in place to acknowledge that a year after giving birth, there needs to be standardized care and practices around that. In addition to that, what we found with our program is that when you offer mental health services to moms in conjunction with their prenatal care, they say yes and they step in and they take it. And it begins to normalize that help and being well is more than just going to the doctor for a checkup appointment, that it also means putting in things, structures in place to take care of your mental well being. And I think that there's something really special about when a mother is engaged in perinatal mental health or any kind of mental health services during pregnancy. There's something special about what she's doing for the baby, even at that point of saying, Mommy's trying to figure out how to take care of what's going with her emotional state. Mommy's trying to figure out how to take care of what's going on with all the things that are in her head and her well being so that you are well as you are growing and developing inside of me. And it also allows for us as infant mental health people to begin to plant those seeds a lot earlier before the baby even actually gets here. So I think normalizing perinatal mental health services as the beginning of infant mental health services and starting there at that point. Other things that I've seen in our work in the perinatal field is normalizing, elevating, and standardizing equitable pay for community-based workers. I think, and this kind of hits on what Carrie was talking about, that village. We have a way in which we have set our system up that it depends on what letters do you have behind your name determine how much you get paid, how much your knowledge is valued. And we've come to learn that in this perinatal work, we've expanded our care to include any and all parts of the village. And that could include doulas, that could include parent support advocates, it could include midwives, and they need to be paid just as much as the doctor that's delivering the babies. So
I'm
I
so
think
glad you
figuring out,
mentioned. Go ahead.
I think policy around paying and funding those that kind of communal knowledge, wisdom, and cultural knowledge needs to be put in place as well.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned that. I think we talk about equity a lot and we need to, and we forget about professional equity. We forget about the community health workers, the peer navigators, those folks with lived experience who are actually so vital to the care in that village, and we're not paying for those services. I also heard you talk so much about the wisdom behind that perinatal space and partnering with families there, really recognizing that the 0 to 3 involves that prenatal and perinatal space, right? And then you spoke about the year after. I'm not sure if we can get the fourth trimester to actually be 12 months long, but I'm with you on that. That year after that baby is born is the most extraordinary, momentous year. And what some people don't recognize is you go to the pediatrician 7 times in that first year of life alone, and that's even if baby's perfectly healthy. And so, what an extraordinary opportunity again to reach parents, right? who we as adults may not be so good at going to our own checkups. But as you mentioned, it's a different thing when you're focused on your wellness in service of your child's wellness. And often it's a little bit easier of a pill to swallow to make sure that that happens. So thank you for that so much. This has been a wide-ranging conversation where you all have talked about the importance of really funding and talking about the village that it takes to take care of children and families. You've talked about the two different pandemics that we've experienced where people who were faced with poverty, institutional racism, other areas where we've seen real inequities before COVID suffered even more so during COVID, and the importance of really taking advantage of this moment in time to build it back better and do it right. So I just want to thank both Marquita and Carrie for joining us today, and want to encourage everybody that if you want to, make sure you get your state's data and learn how you can really take action on behalf of your particular state's infants, toddlers, and their families. Thank you.